April 30th, 1975, Saigon falls to communist troops. Vietnam is no longer America's war to win, and the pictures of U.S. helicopters fleeing from Saigon rooftops create the indelible image of an American defeat. After that war, unlike any in American history, a flood of refugees come pouring out of South Vietnam, a wave of boat people who will write a history all their own. The bitter legacy of Vietnam after the American troops leave, on this edition of the 20th Century. I'm Mike Wallace. Vietnam was America's longest war. Some 57,000 U.S. lives were sacrificed and $150 billion squandered in a lost cause. It was a war the United States wanted to forget and couldn't. Remember the images? Vietnam was history's first living room war. Televised night after night, America had watched this real-life movie starring sons and brothers, husbands, boyfriends. With the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January of 1973, America's combat role in Vietnam ended.
We today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
Most of the U.S. troops were pulled out, but some 9,000 U.S. civilian advisors working with the South Vietnamese government remained. With that peace treaty, the communists got to keep 150,000 troops in the South. And secretly, President Nixon promised continued aid to South Vietnam, plus support from American forces if Hanoi launched another attack like the 1968 Tet Offensive. The communists, battered and bloody, bound their wounds and waited. They waited and they watched as Watergate first corroded Nixon's power and then forced him to resign. They watched the Congress cut aid to South Vietnam as congressional voices reflected public discontent with America's South Vietnamese allies. And they watched as morale in the South plummeted after U.S. aid was slashed. In January of 1975, 2 years after the bulk of American troops were gone, the North Vietnamese decided to test the waters by probing the South's strength in the Central Highlands. When the provincial capital of Phuoc Binh fell, with little resistance and no retaliation by the United States, the Communist North began to roll.
North Vietnamese forces have launched what the Saigon government calls a nationwide offensive campaign in South Vietnam's Central Highlands, overrunning district capitals and army outposts, shelling air bases and towns.
The fighting around the highland city of Ban My Thuot was so heavy that it took the government 3 days to secure an area to land reinforcements.
But the reinforcements were not much help against the North Vietnamese troops, and Ban My Thuot, 160 miles northeast of Saigon, fell in March. Hanoi, which had estimated it would take 2 years to capture Saigon, seemed surprised at its success against an enemy, South Vietnam, better equipped than any other Southeast Asian nation. The fact is, though, that the South's army was papier-mâché, saddled with incompetent officers, fighting for no clearly defined goal on behalf of a bankrupt and corrupt government. Only 4 days after the capture of Ban My Thuot, South Vietnam's President Thieu suddenly pulled his troops out of the Central Highlands.
South Vietnam, in the face of a massive communist offensive, today abandoned 3 Central Highland provinces, Kon Tum, Pleiku, and Darlac. A government spokesman said the decision was made because there was no way to resupply South Vietnamese troops there.
What should have been a retreat became a rout as the North Vietnamese troops cut off a major highway and civilians joined the South Vietnamese military in flight.
Refugees fleeing or trying to flee areas newly controlled by communist forces are now estimated at 1.5 million. This is part of what a Vietnamese reporter calls the Convoy of Tears, a total of about 4,000 vehicles moving from the Central Highlands to the coast.
Communist forces were like a tide bursting out of the highlands, flowing east to the coast over, through, or around any barrier.
With North Vietnamese troops pushing to within 10 miles of Hue, more than half of the city's 140,000 people have fled in a stampede of cars, trucks, and buses. Drivers willing to make the risky run out of Hue on the only road southward to Da Nang are charging exorbitant prices. The refugees unable to afford transportation must walk. But for many, especially the old and the very young, the 65 miles to the comparative safety of Da Nang is an exhausting ordeal that takes from 3 to 5 days.
These people are just part of the greatest flight of refugees ever to occur in Vietnam in all its years of war. Whole families push carts weighed down with precious belongings. Soldiers are trying to get their families out of Hue. Rockets are hitting the center of the city, making everyone aware that the North Vietnamese are not far away. On every face, there is that numbed look of, it's happening again. It's happening 2 years after peace supposedly came to Vietnam.
President Thieu promised to hold the old imperial capital of Hue, but that city fell and panic prevailed. Fearing the communists, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled. They ran because everyone else was running. And they were soon joined in the exodus by many of the best troops of Saigon's army, now a leaderless mob as senior officers deserted. The South's agony intensified.
Communist forces have effectively cut South Vietnam in two. The communists have captured 2 more provinces, giving them control of almost all the northern fourth of the country, with the exception of Da Nang, now virtually isolated.
The refugees came to Da Nang by ship as well as on foot. They were crowded into the ships like sardines, and, like fish, they had to be unloaded in nets. But even as the refugees swarmed ashore in Da Nang, the word was passed that Da Nang itself would be the next place to fall. The refugees who had already come so far were joined by hundreds of thousands in Da Nang seeking to escape. Perhaps 1.5 million people in all. Panic and disorder were the rule.
For 2 days, this teenager from Hue has been haunting the docks of Da Nang, searching for his parents and his 5 brothers. He is sure his family is dead or trapped in the abandoned city, unable to flee. It is emotion shared by thousands all around him and all over Vietnam.
Da Nang was a city in convulsion, its panicked people desperate to get out. An airlift to rescue women and children was improvised, but unruly, undisciplined South Vietnamese soldiers led a frenzied mob trying to get on the plane. CBS News correspondent Bruce Dunning was on board.
There's a mob trying to get on. One by one, they're trying to get on. We can't even get people off who want to get off. There's a sea of humanity jamming on. Impossible to stop the crowd. We're pulling away. We're leaving them behind. We're pulling up with the people are falling off the air stairs. The plane is taking off. There are another dozen or they're running along, grabbing at the air stair. We're pulling them on as fast as we can. Our plane is surrounded here. I don't know how the hell we're going to get out, but we're loading the people on as fast as we can. Women and children are obviously being left behind.
The tension and panic intensified. The heavily armed men were menacing. They left their wives, their children, their aged parents on the runway while they forced their own way on board, a rabble of young enlisted men. As the plane strained laboriously into the air, people were still clinging to the wheels and the rear stairs. 7 men fell off as the plane reached heights of 1,000 feet or more. As the plane reached 6,000 feet, 1 man was still stuck in the ladder.
These men panicked, left their families behind, left everyone behind. There was no attempt to get women and children on, the real refugees. This was the most terrifying experience I've ever had in Vietnam.
After seeing that film, President Ford reportedly told a friend, "That's it. It's time to pull the plug. Vietnam is gone." Not quite. For the tragic spectacle of Saigon's fall lay ahead, and the United States would play a central role in that drama. When it came to Vietnam, President Ford learned he could run, but he couldn't hide.
Can you tell us anything about what you're doing on Vietnam? Hurry up, come on. Can you tell us what you've been doing on Vietnam, Mr. President?
Even as the South Vietnamese army gave way with startling suddenness, the Ford administration refused to talk about plans for evacuating the Americans remaining in Saigon. U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin believed that was the only way to prevent angry South Vietnamese from turning on the departing Americans. More than 5,000 of them seemed trapped, along with as many as 200,000 Vietnamese who had worked for the Americans. So, Saigon waited, the communists edged closer, and fear gripped the capital. The coastal towns of Nha Trang, Cam Ranh, and Phan Rang fell quickly. Now only 200 miles separated the communists from Saigon.
Saigon now is the only major South Vietnamese city controlled by the government, and there political pressure continues to mount against President Nguyen Van Thieu.
Widespread opposition to the Thieu government surfaced, led by Buddhist monks, but joined by Catholic protesters who had been the president's power base. And before flying to safety behind communist lines, a South Vietnamese Air Force lieutenant registered his disillusion with an airstrike on the presidential palace.
2 passes, 2 bombs. At least 3 persons were killed and 4 wounded. But Thieu was not among them. He was not home. The incident did not seem to be a prelude to a coup, but it was evidence of the frustration felt not only by the armed forces, but other Vietnamese as well, with Thieu and his refusal to give up the presidency.
President Thieu's days as the uncontested leader of South Vietnam are numbered. It's only a matter of how and when he'll step aside.
Communist forces capture more territory in South Vietnam, 3/4 of the country now, and are dangerously close to Saigon. Vice President Rockefeller commented today, quote, "It is really too late to do anything to stop the communist advance."
If Americans wanted to forget a war they had lost, still there was the uneasy recognition that the U.S. could not just walk away from a tragedy they had helped create. Among America's obligations were the fate of Vietnam's orphans, many of them fathered by American servicemen. The U.S. government set up an operation to evacuate the orphans to the United States. But shortly after the first takeoff, the plane crashed, scattering bodies and wreckage over a half-mile of rice paddies.
2 hours ago, I watched this airplane take off from Tan Son Nhut Air Base. It was a perfect takeoff, carrying those orphans to the United States. What can one say except, when will the misery in this country ever stop?
Some 100 of the orphans survived that crash. In the end, 2,700 children were airlifted out of Vietnam and Cambodia, but more than 1 million orphans were left behind. On the battlefront, the communists neared Saigon, their ultimate objective.
In South Vietnam, the battle for Saigon apparently is taking shape. Communist forces today launched their first major assault in the capital's region since they began their offensive 5 weeks ago. The heaviest attack was 40 miles east of Saigon at Xuan Loc, which has been battered for the past 2 days by communist rockets.
For a month, the communists had been scoring easy victories as villages fell with barely a shot fired in self-defense. But in mid-April at Xuan Loc, South Vietnam's 18th Division put on what was called the single most gallant stand by Saigon's army. They held out against an unrelenting artillery barrage and an enemy determined to cut a main artery.
The North Vietnamese did not grant these men a safe retreat. They shelled the road, mostly with captured 105mm howitzers. They made it almost impossible to evacuate the wounded and the dead. If the North Vietnamese succeed in cutting Route 1, which is evidently what they're trying to do, they will have trapped an entire infantry division and closed the circle around Xuan Loc. Meanwhile, along Route 1, it was a quiet morning. Government troops rode back and forth near their last outpost 5 miles from Xuan Loc, seemingly oblivious to what was going on just around the corner. But at 1 in the afternoon, suddenly, it was quiet no longer. The North Vietnamese opened up with 130mm artillery fire. Government soldiers at an armored cavalry position ran to their tanks. Their armored cars began to pull out. The position had only been set up yesterday to provide covering fire for the troops defending Xuan Loc. It will be there no longer. Within minutes, Route 1 became like the road from Quang Tri to Hue, from Hue to Da Nang, from Da Nang to Quy Nhon, a river of soldiers and refugees heading toward safety. Most of the civilians had been moving for days. But no matter how fast they ran, the war ran faster.
Just about everyone understood that the battle for Xuan Loc was the beginning of the battle for Saigon, and so the spirited defense put up by South Vietnamese forces in Xuan Loc was timed perfectly. President Ford had just asked an obstinate Congress to send millions more in military and economic aid.
Assistance to South Vietnam at this stage must be swift and adequate. Half-hearted action would be worse than none.
Ambassador Graham Martin assured President Ford that there was no immediate danger in Saigon.
If you mean that South Vietnam is on the imminent verge of collapse, I think the answer is quite definitely no.
Congressional critics grew impatient about the delay in evacuating Americans while the communist vise tightened.
And the pace, in my judgment, is still inadequate.
Officials deny that any evacuation has been ordered, but high-level sources confirm that embassy records are being destroyed, a drastic move made only when the possibility of a quick evacuation is very real.
President Ford had ordered all non-essential Americans out of Saigon.
Moving day. Time for most Americans in Vietnam to pack up and get out. The U.S. Embassy here says that about 1,500 Americans have left in the past 2 weeks, and it places the number remaining now at under 4,000.
Evacuees by the plane load, many of them Vietnamese wives and children of Americans, left for the United States. But thousands of others who had been on the run weren't so lucky.
The No family left Kon Tum in a truck. Near Quy Nhon, the communists shelled the road. No Tan Hue, 25 years old, a teacher, was badly wounded. When they got to Cam Ranh, they scrambled onto fishing boats to get to this ship. When they got on board, No Tan Hue realized his mother, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers were missing. There was nothing he could do. No Tan Hue is treated for his wounds and taken away in an ambulance. The rest of the family will have to continue without him. A man from Hue shows them pictures of his family, the family he hasn't seen in 10 days. He wants to know if the No family has come across them. They explain that they're from Kon Tum, not Hue, that they've taken a different route, but the man doesn't understand.
After 2 weeks of assault waves and mortar fires, Xuan Loc finally, inevitably fell. And on that same day, President Thieu yielded at last to the pressure.
Confronted by continuing political pressures and military defeats, South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned today. Named to succeed Thieu was 71-year-old Vice President Tran Van Hoan, a frequently ill, virtually blind civilian in a military-dominated government.
In resigning, Thieu bitterly assailed the United States. Then came a brief, chaotic game of political musical chairs.
South Vietnamese politicians are scrambling to put together a new government, one that will be acceptable to the communists for negotiations. South Vietnamese President Tran Van Hoan has offered the job of premier and all the real power of government to General Duong Van Big Min.
With the war finally ending, President Ford sounded a note of reassurance.
Today, America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam. But it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned.
The American role as protector is about to end, and some of those who once felt safe are now filled with fear. Their faces tell more than words: hope, despair, resignation. They clutched documents, telegrams or letters from relatives in the States, financial guarantees. Some are waiting for a letter or telegram of sponsorship from the States. Others grasp for any way out. They gather around any American who ventures near. 3 years ago, a woman says, I worked for a U.S. company in Vietnam. Can I get out? Can you sponsor me, asks another. It is painful to have to tell them that there is nothing you can do.
In the midst of the growing chaos, communist troops penetrated to the outskirts of the capital.
The rockets woke Saigon up well before dawn, and soon the boulevards near the central market were choked with smoke and flames and fire trucks and people. Saigon has known for a long time that the war was out there somewhere and getting closer, but it was out of sight and thus could be put out of mind. But no longer. Today, the war has arrived.
A quarter century of American involvement in South Vietnam is over. At mid-afternoon, Saigon time, an armada of 81 U.S. Marine helicopters descended on the South Vietnamese capital. More than 6,000 persons, as many as 900 of them Americans, the rest Vietnamese and third country nationals, were evacuated. Plucked from the U.S. Embassy grounds, from rooftops throughout the city, and from the nearby Tan Son Nhut Airport. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces surrounding Saigon, for the most part, did not interfere. The evacuation order came after South Vietnamese President Duong Van Minh ordered all Americans with the U.S. Defense Attaché Office out of the country within 24 hours, signaling that other Americans should leave too.
It was mid-morning when the word came. A full-scale emergency evacuation had been ordered. All Americans were to report immediately to assembly points designated weeks in advance. When buses arrived at the assembly points, they were soon jammed with anxious Americans and some Vietnamese who slipped aboard.
Some Americans who pushed towards the bus tried to pull their Vietnamese wives and children along with them. There were desperate scenes with families separated and crying out for help, pleading not to be left behind, clutching at the last straw of hope. We rode through the streets of Saigon for more than 4 hours, unable to find a way out or anyone who could tell us where to go. At Tan Son Nhut Airport, armed paratroopers turned our buses back. At one point, we were unloaded on the Saigon waterfront, where we could see American helicopters circling the city, and Vietnamese trying to escape on boats heading to the sea.
The sky over Saigon was filled with dozens of assorted aircraft, helicopters, transports, even fighter bombers in a nameless whirling merry-go-round over the city. U.S. Embassy helicopters flew from roof to roof, plucking up stranded Americans and occasionally depositing them on the landing pad atop the embassy.
We all decided to try and reach the United States Embassy, and once there, we found it surrounded by Vietnamese looking for a way in and a way out. Helicopters were landing on the roof and inside the compound as we walked to the back of the embassy. We had to push and shove our way through a crowd of several hundred Vietnamese trying to scale the walls, only to be knocked back by U.S. Marines.
Inside the building, the evacuees were broken into groups of 50, and then it was a mad dash out the door into the parking lot for the waiting helicopter. Although it seemed much longer, it took only 2 or 3 minutes to load the helicopters, and then it was farewell to Vietnam.
The Vietnamese refugees were helicoptered to the waiting ships of the U.S. 7th Fleet.
On the Midway, the refugees are led quickly away from the howling blast of the helicopters by Navy crewmen. For them, it is only the first leg in a journey away from Vietnam and the war, but perhaps an uncertain future in America.
The American fleet had been having problems since the start of the evacuation with the arrival of South Vietnamese pilots and their helicopters loaded with family and friends. Hovering above the decks to unload their passengers, the pilots were unfamiliar with landing their craft on a moving ship. One crashed into the side of the USS Blue Ridge, others managed to crash land on the deck of the ship. For those that did manage to put down, they were simply pushed over the side and into the sea by U.S. sailors and Marines to make room for the returning American craft based on that ship, filled with evacuees from Saigon. Other South Vietnamese pilots just hovered long enough to unload their passengers and then headed to the side of the ship and just jumped out with their life vests to be picked up by U.S. sailors. Still other pilots headed out to the side of the ships after unloading their passengers and settled the craft into the water and then jumped out, again waiting to be picked up by U.S. sailors.
Critics charged that U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin had been blind to South Vietnam's impending defeat. Now he became one of the last Americans to flee from Saigon. After all the troubled years, U.S. involvement in Vietnam was over.
Practically nothing about Vietnam worked out the way the experts believed it would. For all the blood and sacrifice and money the U.S. poured into that conflict, South Vietnam, left to fight on its own, fell with startling speed. With the surrender of Saigon and the communist victory, Many people predicted a bloodbath, and the world could only watch.
Wednesday, April 30th, the day after the U.S. evacuation, and looters turned Saigon inside out. But within hours of the surrender proclamation, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops rolled into the city.
By Wednesday afternoon, the communist soldiers had moved into downtown Saigon. With their usual discipline, they methodically took over ministries and other government buildings.
The communists renamed Saigon Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the man whose revolution this had always been.
For the communist victors, the next day, May Day, was the occasion for a large celebration. North Vietnamese troops marched casually down Ton Nhut Boulevard, past the fortress-like wall of the abandoned U.S. Embassy, in full field gear, and some of the people of Saigon, in a holiday mood, came out to see them. A little less apprehensive now because there had been no bloodbath.
If there was no bloodbath, there was no utopia either. Thousands of Vietnamese, hopeless and desperate to flee the country, risked storms, disease, and piracy on the South China Sea. Some were lucky enough to latch onto the 7th Fleet during the final hours of the U.S. evacuation.
The very last, the last to escape Vietnam, 100 or so refugees from a sinking ship and a few stray fishing boats plucked from the sea by a U.S. destroyer. Like the others, they went straight to a landing craft bound for Grandee Island in Subic Bay, the temporary processing center. To ask these Vietnamese questions is to receive 100 questions in return. What has happened in Saigon? Do they really call it Ho Chi Minh City? Will the Americans give us land to farm in the United States? Or will we live on Guam forever? They are exiles dreaming exile dreams.
The Pentagon says the U.S. evacuation fleet, more than 40 ships, has left the seas off South Vietnam and now is steaming toward the Philippines, with some 39,000 refugees aboard. And a South Vietnamese fleet of 26 ships under U.S. escort also is headed toward the Philippines with another 30,000. Those figures swell the total number of refugees to well over 100,000.
Who are the evacuees? Who are the people who got out of Vietnam, packed into hastily organized camps here in Guam? Evacuees are children, thousands of them who must be inoculated against childhood diseases. Evacuees are people suffering from the heat, the dust, the strange diet, and the worry. The people here are middle-class Vietnamese, convinced that the new communist government would punish them for siding with the Americans, very likely execute them. As South Vietnam collapsed, they had no one to turn to but the Americans.
Many Vietnamese were in a panic, anxious to get out. Communism had turned their lives to stone. 400,000 who did not escape were sent to so-called re-education camps. The communists put them through long hours of physical labor and political indoctrination. Many inmates were forced to write confessions of alleged past crimes against the communists. Fear of this repression spurred the exodus, and the refugees turned to any country that would have them.
The Danish container ship Clara Maersk carried human cargo into Hong Kong today. 4,400 Vietnamese refugees rescued 5 days ago at sea from a sinking Vietnamese freighter. Tonight in Hong Kong, they cheered and applauded as the Clara Maersk tied up. Every available inch of deck space seemed to be taken. The Hong Kong government says it will accept the refugees temporarily on humanitarian grounds because they are the victims of a disaster at sea.
The stream of refugees continued to flow. Thailand soon became the favored transit point for Indo-Chinese who hoped to be lucky enough to head for the States.
The refugees are crowding into makeshift camps in Thailand at an average rate of 500 a month. Some make it to safety in small boats. Others are lost at sea or caught by communist patrols. They do not bring very many material possessions, but they do bring stories. Stories of hardships, of unemployment, of hunger, and of increasing repression in Vietnam and other Indo-Chinese countries. The overwhelming majority want to go to America, and today some of them got their chance. They arrived in San Francisco aboard a 747 named after a landmark associated with other refugees who came to America 357 years earlier. Nguyen Thien Dinh was a captain in the South Vietnamese Army. Like many other Vietnamese who arrived today, Dinh and his family escaped Vietnam this year in a boat that was slowly sinking 5 nights later when it arrived in Thailand.
I try to find the liberty, that's all. Yeah, because you cannot live with the communists.
the United States took in 145,000 Southeast Asian refugees in the first 12 months after the fall of Saigon. Other Western nations were willing to accept only embarrassingly small refugee quotas. Great Britain allowed in 150. West Germany, 0. And by the spring of 1976, even more Southeast Asian nations pulled in their welcome mat, shutting the door in the face of the refugees who were now being called the boat people.
In Thailand, the refugees are accepted reluctantly, but are forced to stay aboard their boats under close police surveillance. Some refugees have been aboard their cramped floating homes for 5 or 6 months. With the American refugee program now officially closed, these Vietnamese have few places to turn to.
It would be a full year, July of 1977, before President Jimmy Carter would reopen America's door, allowing 15,000 additional refugees into the United States.
The first wave that had come right after the fall of Saigon had been mainly ethnic Vietnamese, the rich and middle class, some farmers. But beginning in 1978, most of the boat people were ethnic Chinese who had lived in Vietnam. Long regarded with suspicion, they became pariahs when conflict broke out between Vietnam and China a year later. Vietnamese authorities encouraged them to leave, but frequently demanded bribes to let them go.
By the summer of 1978, 10,000 boat people a month were making it to the shores of Malaysia, chasing their dream of freedom.
At first, it's hard to make out. A speck on the horizon. Many don't make it this far. These have made it. But will the Malaysian police turn them away? Or will they be stoned by local villagers? The crowd waits to see how many will survive this time. Only a few fishermen helped the boat people ashore. We joined in. As far as we could tell, no one drowned coming ashore.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And just for that, some were grateful.
Thank you, number one.
The police just stood guard. The food came, the water. No one had much to say now. No one asked anymore for help. Do you know where you go now?
I don't know.
They don't tell you where you go?
Yeah, here to the island.
The island. From a distance, visions of a tropical paradise 30 miles out in the South China Sea. Last August, Pulau Bidong was uninhabited. Now, there are more than 23,000 boat people living here, living in a makeshift shanty town, a collection of shacks and tents piled on top of each other. Each refugee will tell their story over and over again. First to a UN representative, later to delegations from different countries that might be willing to accept them. Most we met want to go to the United States. This family's boat was attacked by pirates from Thailand, an all too familiar story for many of the boat people.
Yeah, they were killed by
they killed by knife.
By knife.
And they tried to cut my mother's son the ear and kill, and they threw in the sea.
20 people were killed, another 15 wounded. 2 16-year-old girls were raped. Before we left, the people of Pulau Bidong asked us if they could send a message to the people of the United States.
We, the 3 members of the Vietnamese Refugee Committee here, on behalf of 23,000 refugees, please help us to survive so that one day we can live in freedom again as you all. The United States are our only hope.
It took news reports out of the refugee camps in Malaysia to wake up the United States and the international community. The question was, what would they do about it? Confronted by a seemingly endless flood of Indo-Chinese refugees, Congress established a pecking order for admission to the United States. Refugees who had close relatives here, those who had worked for the U.S. government in Vietnam, those who feared for their lives, and everyone else. For everyone else, that meant a long, long wait.
And the waiting wasn't easy. By the fall of 1978, it wasn't even easy to find a place to drop anchor. Even worse, refugee boats had become refugee ships like the Hai Hong, packed with ethnic Chinese. They'd been turned away by Thailand, Singapore, and Indonesia before Malaysia allowed the cargo ship to anchor offshore.
The decks are overflowing with people. Virtually every inch of available space has someone living in it. A small tramp steamer like the Hai Hong usually carries a crew of about 20. But since it began its journey off the coast of Vietnam nearly 1 month ago, it's been home to more than 2,500 people. Hundreds and hundreds of men, women, and children lying about limply. With each passing day, they grow more weak in the stifling air. The stench is overpowering. The refugees say that at night, cockroaches and mice come out to crawl among their bodies. The only relief is to climb a dangerous ladder to the equally crowded decks. Malaysia says it does not consider this huge group to be legitimate refugees because it says they bought their way out of Vietnam with the active help of communist authorities.
Malaysian officials, now treating the boat people as illegal immigrants rather than refugees, refused to take in anyone from that ship. But Canada, France, and Belgium reached out to the boat people, and faced with 5 times as many refugees as previously estimated, the United States increased its quota.
The Carter administration said today it's prepared to admit into the United States almost 22,000 Southeast Asian refugees.
Meanwhile, Hong Kong had been giving sanctuary to thousands of refugees, particularly those on smaller boats. But by the spring of 1979, the numbers became overwhelming.
Vietnamese refugees are arriving in Hong Kong in such large numbers that the government faces a major crisis. In early May, more than 900 people have arrived each day, all of them in small boats. Most have been intercepted as they reached Hong Kong waters and escorted by police to this government dockyard where they wait, jammed in their boats for immigration officers to begin processing them ashore. Since the first of the year, more than 21,000 Vietnamese have swarmed into this small British colony. But if the current rate continues, that figure will be more than doubled in the month of May. This man, whose boat had just arrived, told us the refugees head for Hong Kong now because it has a policy of accepting these small boats. He said just under 100 people were crammed aboard this 35-foot craft, which took 3.5 weeks to make the journey from Saigon. Once ashore, the refugees are taken to abandoned warehouses. Officials acknowledge that housing more than 2,000 people in such a building is risky, but there are no alternatives.
But for every refugee who made it to freedom, scores of boatloads drifted in the South China Sea. Some Americans pressed President Carter to open the gates wider.
We should have American ships out there in the seas right now, picking up these people.
65 nations attended a July 1979 UN conference on the plight of the boat people. Its aim? To convince Vietnam to slow the flight of the refugees.
Secretary General Kurt Waldheim made the announcement on behalf of Vietnam. As of today, Hanoi will make every effort to stop boat people from leaving and will cooperate with the UN in setting up arrangements for refugees to leave safely and directly from Vietnam.
But Hanoi didn't follow through, and the refugee avalanche continued. Thousands more died at sea. President Carter dispatched the 7th Fleet on a rescue mission to the South China Sea.
A high-flying reconnaissance aircraft from the carrier Kitty Hawk spotted this boat with 21 Vietnamese on board, some 60 miles east of Malaysia. The USS Parsons, a guided missile destroyer, was ordered to pick them up. Reaching the boat after dark, the Parsons brought 7 men, 5 women, and 9 small children aboard.
All the refugees picked up in recent days by the 7th Fleet are guaranteed permanent homes in the U.S. The latest search operations serve as visible proof of America's renewed resolve to help the boat people. Cooking is what he was hired to do aboard Sea Sweep, a mercy ship looking for boat people fleeing their homeland and his, Vietnam. But 54-year-old Quan Du Chan, who calls himself August, is also searching for refugees. In this case, his wife and 2 sons. He knows they reached Malaysia safely in June. But like these 93 Vietnamese rescued in mid-July, his 3 loved ones may also have been towed away from Malaysia, possibly lost and alone now on the high seas.
I am very worried about my wife and my son.
Among the 250,000 refugees who made it to U.S. shores by 1981, many found themselves competing for jobs with Americans. They confronted racism and resentment. And on the Texas Gulf Coast, Vietnamese shrimpers nearly reached a flashpoint with the locals over fishing rights.
Since Colonel Nguyen Van Nam and several hundred Vietnamese moved to Seabrook, Texas, they've had nothing but trouble. 3 of their boats have been burned, and the Ku Klux Klan has held several rallies in which effigies of Vietnamese boats have been set ablaze.
I can speak most emphatically and positively that the Ku Klux Klan is more than willing to select out of the ranks of American fishermen some of your more hardy souls and send them through our training camps. And when you come out of there, you'll be ready for the Vietnamese.
A court hearing starts tomorrow on the Vietnamese suit to keep the Klan from making threats or committing acts of violence against the Vietnamese.
In May of 1981, a Texas judge issued an injunction against the harassment, forbidding Klansmen from appearing in Klan robes within eyesight of a Vietnamese fisherman. But competing for scarce jobs meant hard times for many of these newest Americans. It meant high unemployment and often dependence on welfare. But there were successes too. Perhaps nothing better symbolized the triumph of the refugees against the odds than the story of Jean Nguyen.
10 years ago, the young girl left Vietnam with her family, part of the exodus that followed the fall of Saigon. They came to the United States with no possessions and not knowing a word of English. The young girl studied hard, learned English, and finished high school in the top of her class. And this May 22nd to be exact, is a big date on her calendar. Just 10 years from the time she left Vietnam, she will graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point.
Citizen, I feel it's my obligation, my duty to serve my country. And it's my honor to be part of the Long Gray Line.
The Long Gray Line of West Point cadets was a lifetime away from the turmoil of the final days of Saigon. Still, for Jean Nguyen, as well as for the hundreds of thousands of refugees who reached freedom, their remarkable odyssey continued.
We just take one day at a time, and we face, even though we face the hurdles, but we overcome them. And it doesn't matter how long it's going to take us to sail that boat to our destination, as long as we get there. That is our goal. And I'm still on that boat.
When the U.S. had finally signed a peace agreement with North Vietnam in 1973, when the POWs came home, when the last combat troops pulled out, America wanted nothing more than to treat the whole Vietnam experience like a bad dream. But the fall of Saigon and the plight of the boat people that followed reminded Americans that once the U.S. committed its power and prestige, it could not then simply walk away from its responsibility. The Vietnam War taught Americans that there are limits to power, even to the most powerful nation in the world. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.